Good evening and welcome. My name is Jeanette Sanger, and I'm the chair of our lecture and exhibition committee. Tonight, we are honored to have Colm Tóibín speaking about his magnificent historical novel, The Magician, about Thomas Mann. The book has received dazzling reviews everywhere and selected as a notable book of the year by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Vogue. The list goes on and on. In addition, the New York Times named it Critics' Pick and a top 10 book of historical fiction. I have pages of praise for this book and how I wish I could read them all. I promise they are all true. As a bookseller, I would have ordered hundreds of copies of this book, and we would have put it in the window and had a huge overflowing event upstairs. I love this book. My husband and I read The Magic Mountain at the height of the COVID epidemic. It seemed the perfect book at the time. And I was so eager to learn more about Thomas Mann after finishing it. The Magician is an enthralling exploration of the heart and mind of a great writer. As Dwight Garner said in the New York Times, The Magician recaptures a literary giant, symphonic and moving, maximalist in scope, but intimate in feeling. There is so much to say about Colm Tóibín, so I will limit my remarks so you can enjoy the opportunity to hear his own eloquent voice. Colm Tóibín is the author of 10 novels, including The Magician. His previous novel, The Master, won the LA Times Book Review, the winner, and Brooklyn was the winner of the Costa Book Award. Then came The Testament of Mary and Nora Webster, as well as 2 story collections and several books of criticism. He is the Irene and Sidney Silverman Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University and 3 times shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Tóibín lives in Dublin and New York. And now let us welcome Colm Tóibín.
Hello, how are you? Thank you very much for coming. I want to talk first about a number of houses that were sort of anchors for me as I was writing this book. Inspirations, places to go that I could, no matter what I was doing, just start thinking again about the house. And the house then would give me images and would give me moments where I could further imagine the life of Thomas Mann, who was born in Lübeck in the north of Germany in 1875 and died in Switzerland in 1955. The first house was the house where his mother was born. It's in a place called Paraty, which is an inlet in Brazil, in between Sao Paulo and Rio. And the house is right on the water, and the water, being inlet water, is very calm. And I went there with the Australian novelist Richard Flanagan, and Richard said that he lives on the water like that in the Southern Hemisphere, and that at night, the stars would hit the water, and the water being calm would then reflect the starlight into the upper rooms of that building. So you have to imagine a little girl being brought from that world where her father was German. There's a great trade between Lübeck and Brazil because Lübeck is the center of marzipan making in Germany, and they need all the sugar they can get. So the big sugar ships would come from Brazil to Lübeck. And her father was a German trader in sugar, and her mother was Brazilian, meaning that she was of mixed origin. And so this girl had, certainly within the Lübeck being a very stable and conservative place, that she would have been an exotic figure there when she arrived at the age of 7 or 8, having been brought up in Brazil. And that house gave me an idea of the sort of mixture in Thomas Mann and his siblings between Hanseatic trade, which is sort of stable and serious and Protestant, and this Brazilian mother. The second house is the house in Lübeck itself. Lübeck was heavily bombed in the war, And so the whole sort of medieval configuration is missing, but the churches have been restored, the big churches, and also the Buddenbrooks house, the house of Thomas Mann's grandparents that he would have gone to as a child, where the offices of the Mann family were, and where they lived upstairs in some grandeur, but right in the middle of the city. His family went back generations as traders, and his father died when he was in his teens, early teens, and his father ordered in his will that the company, this great company that had gone on for generations, be wound up, and the Manns were suddenly at sea. In other words, neither Thomas nor his brother really wanted to become people involved in commercial life, that they were both wanted to be artists. And then there were two girls, and then there was a younger brother, but he was too young to take over the family firm. So the family firm was wound up. And I think this is a great gift to any writer, the idea that you have something that was so filled with rich detail, with grandparents, great grandparents, a sense of extraordinary, I suppose, things being passed on from one generation to the next, and even though Germany became unified in 1871, it would have made little difference to these people because their trade, of course, was out into the Baltic and the Atlantic. And so it was gone. It was absolutely disappeared. In other words, Thomas Mann's mother went to live in Munich, which was really very far away from Protestant Lübeck, and the family went with her. And suddenly it was all over. What had been so strong, what had been so powerful, was now dissolved. And I think how we know this, how we see this as a gift, is we see it in the novel Buddenbrooks, which Thomas Mann began to work on when he was about 22 or 23, and published when he was 26. That he really attempts to lovingly recreate the entire atmosphere, not only of his own upbringing, but of the upbringing of his parents and of his aunt, and the upbringing indeed of his grandparents, so that he imagines something that he did not even experience, but imagines it as though he was in the room with it. There's a sense in Buddenbrooks not only of something being recovered that was lost, but something being reimagined that was never experienced in the first place, but somehow or other held a place in his imagination, that he came from this family and that it had all ended, and the only way to remake it was in a book. There are some other houses. There's a house in Munich that he eventually built, but there are houses missing. There's a house right in the center of Munich that was destroyed in the war, where Thomas Mann's wife, Katia Pringsheim, was brought up. And he married very cleverly. She was from a very rich family in Munich. They were great bohemians, but they also, of course, had a great establishment through marvelous parties. Even though they were assimilated Jews, they were very close to the Wagners, and they had been involved in funding the building of Bayreuth. And Katia's brother was studying conducting with Mahler in Vienna. So they were people of very high culture, and as I say, a lot of money. And they had one girl. And if you go to Lübeck now, there's a painting in the museum, and it was a painting that Thomas Mann saw a reproduction of when he was growing up in Lübeck, of these famous children, the Pringsheim children, dressed up as in circus costume. The painting, 4 boys and a girl, and Katia is the girl. She was one of the first women to study science in a German university. Her grandmother was the most famous German feminist. So in her early 20s, she married Thomas Mann and had 6 children with him. I don't think she was under any illusions about his sexuality. I mean, that he was primarily homosexual. He had 6 children with her, but it was not as though he had any interest in any other women. And in 1910, 1911, they went to Venice. And in her memoirs, Katia, she wrote her memoirs in her 90s. She dictated them. They're short. They make clear what a tolerant, interesting, intelligent person she was. And she said, yes, we were in Venice, and Tommy, she called her husband Tommy, could not stop looking at this boy on the beach. Yes, all of that happened. And it wasn't as though she was shocked by it. And it wasn't as though she didn't tolerate it. That was another aspect of the world, and that was how he was. And from her, he got his novel, The Magic Mountain. In other words, she was soon after that. She was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and she went to Davos in Switzerland. And she went to the Magic Mountain, in other words. And unfortunately, we don't have the letters she wrote because they were destroyed in the war. But she wrote him letters. We know that she wrote him letters regularly describing every moment of the sanatorium, the other patients, the atmosphere, the food, the schedules, and the treatment. And eventually he went to see her. And out of that single visit, going to see her, he got the visit in the Magic Mountain of Hans Castorp to see his cousin. He went for 3 weeks. He stayed for 7 years. And so that Thomas Mann quite early, because the book Buddenbrooks was really immensely successful, and he was a famous writer really from that time, and he created a great establishment in Munich. And in other words, the house in Munich has been restored, and it's filled with, like it's on 4 floors. It's stately. It's got verandas. It's got gardens, and he really began, quite early, to have a schedule of his own that he wrote in the mornings, usually for 4 hours. He wrote essays, he wrote his novels, he wrote his stories, and rigidly no one was allowed to go near him at that time of the day. And then in the afternoons, he would have a nap, he would go for a walk, but he was a very domestic figure. It wasn't as though he was bohemian, that he went to cafes, or he had friends, a large group of literary friends who met together regularly. He was really alone. His older brother was a writer, but they drifted apart from each other. His main life was lived in the house with his wife and children. But while he was there with them, he was also apart from them. The children remember him as being often difficult and silent and remote and cold. And so that when we come to 1914, I think it comes as a great surprise when we realize that all along something has been boiling in him, which is a sort of German patriotism. That as the war breaks out, he becomes a sort of Prussian militarist. He really goes nuts. It looks awful, some of the articles he writes, where he really wants blood and he wants German victory, and he believes that Germany is a culture. Around Germany is merely the civilizations, and civilizations are thin, whereas German culture has roots, and its roots are in this musical tradition, but in many other things too. And he attempts to write a book. And if anyone wants to see what a really bad book looks like, have a look at his book called Reflections of a Non-Political Man, which has just been reissued, which is his efforts during the war to think through what it means to be a German artist. And we realize that, like many writers, he is not a thinker. He is not a philosopher. He's not an intellectual. He had a friend coming regularly to the house, a man called Ernest Bertram, who later became a sort of intellectual Nazi. He was the closest, Thomas Mann, he was the closest friend among the Nazis. He came to advise him on Nietzsche. And Thomas Mann listened carefully and tried to work this out. Basically, for the war years, it's almost an interregnum in his life. He really is fired up with enthusiasm and patriotism. Of course, Germany is defeated. Of course, the ideas that he puts out in his book turn out to be not only not very interesting, but really very dangerous. And really, by 1919, 1920, he's become a different sort of man. He's moved from being a monarchist, which he was during the war and before the war, to being a Democrat. And part of the reason is, of course, that his wife is a much more intelligent person politically, much more astute. And also, the defeat of Germany has been horrible, seeing the maimed figures on the street. Just want to read you a small bit from the very early part of the book, which is describing the childhood, the idea of having a mother in this Lübeck who comes from Brazil, as to what this might mean. So it's Thomas and his older brother Heinrich and their mother. In the evenings, if the senator, who's their father, were at a meeting, or in the time when Thomas and Heinrich, having done their violin practice and eaten their supper, were in their nightclothes, their mother would tell them about the country of her birth, Brazil. A place so vast, she said, that no one knew how many people were there, what they were like, or what language they spoke. A country many times the size of Germany. There was no winter, never any frost or real cold. And where one river, the Amazon, was more than 10 times longer than the Rhine, and 10 times as wide, many smaller rivers flowing into it, that reach back deep into the forest, with trees higher than trees anywhere else in the world, with people whom no one had ever seen or would see, since they knew the forest as no one else did, and they could hide if an intruder or an outsider came. Tell us about the stars, Heinrich would say. Our house in Paraty was on the water, his mother would reply. It was almost part of the water, like a boat. And when night came and we could see the stars, they were bright and low in the sky. Here in the north, the stars are high and distant. In Brazil, they are visible like the sun during the day. They are small suns themselves, glittering and close to us, especially those of us who live near water. My mother said you could sometimes read a book in the upstairs rooms at night, because the light from the stars against the water was so clear. And you could not sleep unless you fastened the shutters to keep the brightness out. When I was a girl the same age as your sisters, I really believed that all the world was like that. The shock on my first night in Lübeck was that I could not see the stars. They were covered over by clouds. Tell us about the ship. You must go to sleep. Tell us the story of all the sugar. Tommy, you know the story of the sugar, but just a small part again. Well, all the marzipan that is made in Lübeck uses sugar that comes from Brazil. Just as Lübeck is famous for marzipan, Brazil is famous for sugar. When the good people of Lübeck and their children eat their marzipan on Christmas Eve, little do they know that they are eating a part of Brazil. They're eating sugar that came across the sea just for them. Why don't we make our own sugar? Thomas asked. You must ask your father that. One of the big changes that happened after the death of Thomas Mann was the publication of his diaries. At the end of his life, when he was making his will, he first of all said that diaries were to be published 35 years after his death, and then he changed that to 25. The fact that diaries were published 20 years in German in 1975, and the diaries gave us a view of him that really was not apparent from the sort of official figure who won the Nobel Prize in 1929. I suppose he was the most respectable German alive, and he was someone who came out of the war period, I think, with his integrity intact. And nobody understood that his secret erotic desires went right through his life, that he would, at a reading or a public event, when he was giving lectures, which were very scholarly, very stiff, very serious, very well attended, that when he went home, he would say that he had seen a young man in the third row or the second row. He'd caught his eye for a moment. And that catching of the eye might be enough to give him a sort of an erotic charge, which he would note down in his diary. His diaries are also filled with a sort of unease that one doesn't expect from someone who was so sort of publicly secure, who was so confident. The idea that he was never sure, he took sleeping pills, he was never quite sure that he's, as a social entity, that he really functioned properly. And you can imagine poor scholars who were working on the story of Death in Venice, seeing its symbolic nature, its story as metaphor, realizing that actually this happened. That this, while he surrounded it with various, obviously he didn't just write it as autobiography, he recreated it, but nonetheless the central image of the German writer watching the boy on the beach in Venice is an image which came not from his imagination, but from his life, but something that was really pressing on him quite seriously throughout his life. And there's a moment, an extraordinary moment really, when he's 75, and he falls for a Bavarian waiter in a Swiss hotel. And he really falls in love with him, and he wants to see him. And what's strange is that his wife and his daughter are arranging meetings between him and the waiter, just to cheer him up, just to keep the old magician happy. They call him the magician. And he writes in his diary that he would ready to give up world fame, that the fame he has won in the world, he would sacrifice that, he would exchange that for time with this waiter. So that the diaries really made people sit up and think that all that strange eroticism in the Magic Mountain, all that business of these people being sort of cooped up, that all of this came from something that was pressing on the author. Obviously, Death in Venice did. And then there are scenes in Dr. Faustus, or even scenes in Buddenbrooks that look like code, look like things hidden of homosexual desire. Obviously, he's fascinating, you see, because many other things interested him as well. That while he had these secret erotic dreams, he had also many other dreams. He really cared about the German tradition in music and the German tradition in poetry. And he eventually, as the 1920s went on, he cared about democracy. And he realized what democracy meant because it was being threatened. At first, like many people, he didn't see the threat as being significant. He didn't see, he didn't foresee the rise of Hitler, but he certainly opposed it. And So that in 1933, he was out of the country when Hitler came to power, and he didn't come back in. His children advised him not to come back in, and he didn't. And so began his exile from 1933. It lasted really for the rest of his life. He never lived in Germany again. And he went first to Switzerland, and then he went to France, and then he went to America. As the 20s began, something really new changed. Something really new happened in Germany, as in many other places. It wasn't merely that Thomas Mann became a Democrat, but his children in their late teens, especially his two eldest children, Erika and Klaus, became poster children in Germany for the new freedom. In other words, that after the war, people didn't want any more rules, didn't want generals telling them what to do, didn't want to do any marching in line. They wanted to do whatever they wanted. They wanted to sleep with whoever they liked. They wanted to say whatever they liked, wear whatever they liked. And his two children, Erika and Klaus, were openly homosexual in a way their father was not. They were both artists, Erika as an actress and a producer of theatre, and Klaus as a writer. And they wanted excitement in their life. They wanted to tour the world. They wanted to go to Persia. They wanted to go to New York. They wanted to put on a theatre play. Klaus would write a play about four young people who were in love with each other. They would act in it and bring it all over Germany. Crowds would come to see it. They would be photographed. They'd be written about. They became almost more famous than their father. And of course, they were implacably anti-fascist. Erika ran a theatre show, a sort of review, a cabaret, anti-fascist, and they were marked people. So in 1933, they too had to leave Germany. And while their father had consolidated his position in the world, and he knew how to run his own day, which was he was a writer, the two children did not know as much as he did about how to be quiet in a city. They wanted more and more excitement, and of course, in the case of Klaus, it meant that he began to take drugs, he began to use morphine. And in the case of Erika, she became deeply dissatisfied with her life. And she even, well, at one point for her passport, she married W.H. Auden. The extraordinary house is the house in California that Thomas Mann built in 1942. And it's in Pacific Palisades. It's painted white. There were very big gardens. It used to have a view of the Sierra and a view of Santa Catalina Island. Strangely, for a man in his 60s, it included a lot of bedrooms for his children, because of his 6 children, 4 of them still hadn't settled. Even though they were moving into their 30s and 40s, that the war and the Hitler years had meant that they did not put down domestic roots of their own. So he needed this house. And I want to read a small bit where he's in this house, and he has got his 6 children out of Europe. In a sense, he's rescued them. He's got his brother out of Europe. He's got his sister-in-law out of Europe, but he himself and his wife out of Europe. So they're out of danger. But of course, he knows what the danger is. And he knows how many other people, including people he knows well, who are in great danger. His brother's first wife is being held in a concentration camp. Will have her health destroyed in the war. Many other people. And so he asks his son, Michael, who plays the viola, who's a member of a string quartet, if in this house in Pacific Palisades, in one night, he could come with the quartet, and just for the family, just as some way of recognizing that what Germany might mean, play something German that was innocent, not bombastic symphonic music, not Wagner, of course, not Wagner, but something utterly delicate and utterly beautiful. And they play Beethoven's Opus 1 through 2 in the living room of this house, which I went to first in 2005. I saw that living room and his study in the shadows, a more shadowy space study just there. He had his own staircase from just outside his study to his own bedroom. And he really lived very well, considering some of the exiles were living in poverty. He was not living in poverty. And so this is his son, Michael, and his quartet playing Opus 1 through 2. When the music began, Thomas was struck by its daring, the quiet release of a sort of anguish, or by a tone that suggested struggle. with hints that the struggle brought pain and joy, immense joy. He knew, stop thinking, give up trying to find simple meaning in the music, but instead let it enter his spirit, listen to it as though he might never get another chance. It was hard not to look at the players, however, not to study their seriousness and concentration. Thomas watched them taking their cues from the lead violinist. The lead violinist and Michael, who's Thomas Mann's son, on the viola, seemed to spar, taking energy from each other. The music edged towards resolution and held back for a moment before it soared. Thomas glanced over at Katia, his wife. He smiled at him. This was the world of her parents, who had hosted many such chamber concerts in their house in Munich. Out of this old world from which they had been forced to flee, Michael, their son, had emerged as the one with musical talent. Thomas watched him playing with slow care, showing no emotion, as handsome and self-possessed. He let the viola's dark sound hit against the sweeter sound of the two violins. As the music continued, the lead violinist and the cellist shed some of their Americanness. The rangy, friendly, masculine openness, apparent earlier, was replaced, he saw, by vulnerability, sensitivity, until they could have been Germans or Hungarians from decades before. Maybe he thought it was merely something he imagined, something caused by the force of the four instruments playing together, as they found moments of pure connection with one another, then went silent or played solo. But Thomas could entertain the idea that ghosts from an earlier time, ghosts who had once walked the streets of Europe, of the European cities, carrying instruments, ghosts on their way to rehearsal, were present here in this new house overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Southern California. Thomas Mann becomes heroic, I think, he's not a hero in his own house. His children don't think he's a hero, and his wife has to lead him, on a number of occasions. But I think, obviously, as an artist, for the books he wrote, but also for something that happened beginning in about 1942 or 43, that he became a really important figure in America. President Roosevelt trusted him and liked him, and he began to tour America, making a speech. But mainly it was the same speech, and it was called The Coming Victory of Democracy. And here was this German author. Now, there was no equivalent Japanese author or no equivalent Italian author. He was alone doing this. And in his faltering English, he made this speech saying that democracy would return, and it was an essential element for the furtherance of the human condition. In other words, that it wasn't just something, wasn't a gift, wasn't something that could be taken away, wasn't something that could be debated. It was an essential ingredient of our way of being in the world. And he made this speech in ways which were both, I think, morally exalted in certain ways, but also plain, also serious. And he got audiences in places like Oklahoma of 5,000 people came to see Thomas Mann speak. Because what they were hearing was some notion of what Germany might be after the war. The speeches were not about winning the war or defeating the Nazis. That was taken for granted. The speeches were about what would happen afterwards, what it would mean to, why such a war was being fought in the first place, for freedom. What did freedom mean? Was freedom a gift? Was freedom essential? And he made these speeches in the same years as he was writing his novel, Dr. Faustus, which attempted to deal with a German artist in the early 20th century who made a pact with the devil and produced this astonishingly modern, cutting-edge music in return for some sort of deal with the devil. And so that he would go home and work on the book, he would go out and make the speech. After the war, he had worn out his welcome in America, as especially had his daughter Erica. Erica didn't have American citizenship, so they could deport her any time. And the FBI began to harass her. And the FBI indeed began to look into the case of Thomas Mann and his connections to communism, which were zero, and just zero. He had absolutely no interest in communism, but because he'd been anti-fascist, he could be tainted or tarred very easily with this. And anyway, he was denounced in Congress at one point. And when he went back to Germany in 1949, he had a choice because he wanted to go into the East as much as the West. And the Americans said, the East is not a free country. There's no freedom of speech. There's no free press. It's a Soviet puppet state. And he said, well, I live in the language. I live in the German language. The German language is spoken on both sides of this line we've made. I didn't make the line, you made the line. But I made the language, I live in the language. And the Germans said, or the Americans said, don't be stupid. Your language will be censored in the East. They said, no, they've said I can say whatever I like, which is so naive because, of course, it would be reported or not, depending on how it pleased him. In any case, he went into Germany. He went into East Germany in 1949, and he found America a very cold place when he returned. And in 1952, they decided to pack up again, go on their travels once more, sell the house in Pacific Palisades, and go back to Switzerland. And he wrote one more book, which I think is another stroke of genius, really, where instead of we talk about late work being very brave and serious, and we look to late Beethoven quartets, late Shakespeare, and late Henry James, but in the case of Thomas Mann, he wrote a comic novel at the end of his life called Felix Cruel, about a chancer, con man, and an imposter. And he put versions of himself into the book, making himself into a sort of ludicrous character. It's a great European novel, I suppose, self-deprecating, and really about the figure at the edge of the crowd in Carnival who's picking everyone's pocket and getting away with it. The sort of, I suppose, Pinocchio figure or the Don Quixote figure. And he died in 1955. And so that my novel deals with all of that period in his life that I've described. I suppose a life that's punctuated by the creation of these very beautiful houses and these I think very important books. But what I'm interested in is the gap between the private life and the public man, the gap between the figure who sits down to breakfast in the morning and the man that imagines. And in the case of Mann, I think that gap is a very large one between the figure who was photographed, between the man in the suit, between the figure visiting the White House, and this much more shambling, shivering private man whose sexuality was uncertain, and who felt that loss of Lubeck in his early life to be a loss that I think shadowed him throughout his life. And I think with someone, strangely, was at a loss in life in a way that he managed to disguise and mask. And I think that gap between who he was and who he seemed is a gap that gave him a lot of energy. It wasn't as though it may have kept him awake at night, but it gave him a lot of psychic and imaginative energy. And that's the space I'm interested in, is the space that lives there in the gap between the mask and what's beneath the mask. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That splendid presentation. Wow, just beautiful, and beautiful passages reading, and it's just lovely. Audience members, thank you for being here. I'm Sarah Holliday, the head of events at the library, and I'm just here to do a little bit of moderating for our question and answer period. So do put your questions and comments, please, in the chat on the right side of the screen, and we'll dive into those. So someone speaking, I'm sure for many people, says, I loved both The Master and The Magician. What were the differences in writing the two books? And I want to append to that, particularly because Henry James wrote in English and Thomas Mann wrote in German. So it seems like very different research processes, or maybe not.
Yes, I think that makes a difference, that if you're writing in English, James's style, you have to take it into account. Even if you're ignoring it, you have to ignore it knowingly. In the case of Mann, because you're writing in English, you don't have to worry about that in the same way. But I think the really big difference is war. That Henry James, even though he grew up and wrote his early stories set in the American Civil War, and at the end of his life, he lived for 2 years for 18 months during the First World War. But in the middle is a period of peace. And he could move, he could go to France, he could go to Italy, he could live in England, go back to America without the feeling that he was going to be torpedoed or that he was going to be in exile by violence. And so I didn't have to worry about public events. In other words, if I have Henry James in 1900 is not a big year for a war or for some sort of public event. So I could keep the book intimate without having to worry that I was ignoring something that impinged largely on James's life. The problem about someone, James was born in 1843, if you're born 32 years later, as was Thomas Mann, you don't have that luxury. And as a novelist describing, you don't have that luxury of keeping life intimate. So that Mann, his life is deeply affected and turned upside down by the First World War, by the Munich Revolution, the Soviet Revolution in Munich in 1918, 1919, by the rise of Hitler, by the Second World War, and by the Cold War. And my job is to keep that, is to maintain intimacy while paying attention to these large events. And so you really are on a tightrope, because if you give in and you have too much about Hitler, then you lose the author and his family. And so you just have to keep remembering, what was he thinking in that year? And then have so many events happening in his own sort of drawing room and living room. But also, Thomas Mann's first novel, Buddenbrooks, is so autobiographical that you can really make use of it. And in a way that Henry James, while he wrote memoirs at the end of his life, his memoirs tend to be concealed much more than they reveal. So Buddenbrooks is a great help. But they are both, I suppose, great novelists who are both, let's say, people whose sexuality is ambiguous and whose ambition is enormous, and who had an extraordinary sort of strength in the sort of way they completed big books, but a great weakness in other ways in their lives. So there are sort of many similarities.
That's fascinating. And in some ways, far more difficult to be a writer, to be a novelist in the first half of the 20th century, and in some ways, so much grist for the mill. I mean, obviously, people did many different things with it. Do you think that one can fully appreciate Mann's novels in translation?
This is a great subject. He worked mainly with a single translator called Helen Tracy Lowe Porter. Helen Tracy Lowe Porter, she lived in Princeton. She literally, and I promise I'm not making this up, she is the great grandmother of Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister in England. Everyone blames her for everything. You know, and people say, oh, you don't understand. It's the translation is the problem. In recent years, the books have been retranslated, and some of those retranslations are very, very good, and they're becoming the standard use. But Germans say that there's a heaviness, and a sort of, because there's a heaviness in his use of German, he's also able to parody that. And there's a level of command of the language that you really need to be German to get any sense of why you might not want to read him, or why you should even appreciate him more. So Germans look at us reading him in English. I mean, look, you don't understand. I had to go to Germany with this book. I had to go and get interviewed, you know, in public. I had to make speeches. I was on radio and television. And you realize that, you know, I am an outsider in this language, and that they see him. They see him. You see, because he came out of the Second World War in a unique position as a figure of great integrity. They don't want anything about him that suggests weakness. They don't want this Irish guy going on saying, well, you know, he wasn't in his own household such a hero. They don't want to hear that. And but partly it's because they appreciate his style in a very different way than we do.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Someone asks, which of his books do you think most represents Mann?
Oh, you know, he's fascinating in a way because he changes as a novelist. So it's not as though you can say there's a single writer called Thomas Mann. That Buddenbrooks is a great 19th century blockbuster novel. It's a family saga, you know, and but really once he moved into the Magic Mountain, he became interested in philosophy and in trying to explore various ideas, especially about decay and Europe. In that book, I mean, while he did have characters, and he did have, you know, drama between them, there are a lot of chapters in which he deals, for example, with the matter of time. How are we to judge time? And obviously in the Magic Mountain, that's a very important question because it moves both slowly and quickly. But he becomes fascinated at the idea of time as something that we cannot measure, that we almost have to imagine. So there are many large questions down within the Magic Mountain. And then when he comes to Dr. Faustus, he wants to deal with the philosophy of music. And So, and deal with the philosophy of music using a lot of systems of parody and pastiche. So he's quite hard to pin down as a novelist. So that I think each of us might want to read him at a different time of our lives.
What people remembered as their famous favorite book by Mann, and Buddenbrooks was definitely the winner among the very unrepresented poll there. So, do you think that Mann would be awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature for his work under today's standards?
I think that his book, Death in Venice, might be quite a difficult book to publish now. And he probably would not have published it. And it would have been, I think, treated in a very different way. This sort of, middle-aged man on a beach sort of ogling this boy. I think it would be something that I can't see that. I mean, it's almost like Nabokov's Lolita, that those sort of books, it'd be hard to see one of them being published now, just in these years. But otherwise, yes. Otherwise, oddly enough, you see, because he changed and became this great advocate of democracy in a place where this was being questioned, he does have a sort of as a humanist writer, he has a great importance, and that's something that the Nobel people are meant to take into account.
Did you intend to compare pre-Nazi Germany's sentiments toward democracy to pro-Trump US sentiments toward democracy, or we could more generally say parallels between the two eras? Yes, no?
The answer to that is yes. I mean, I was writing this book as a lot of people, including myself, were thinking that it would be impossible that Donald Trump would be elected president of the United States. And then watching, to our consternation, as this seemed more and more feasible, as he got the nomination from his own party, as he had a special way of sort of dominating television, as the very coarseness and crudeness seemed to actually hold people's imagination. And then he won. And then we watched, when he won, the things that happened. So I'm writing this book, and my job is to not deliberately or openly or obviously show the connection, because the connection's there. There's nothing you can do about it. But I think the more you would try and push the connection, the more you would lose the connection. This is about how fragile democratic systems are. This is about how easy it is for a bully to emerge by just the strength of the sheer ugliness of his opinions to actually take over people's imaginations. There was one thing that really worried me, where I'm trying to think of an example of something that really worries Thomas Mann, but I want it to be, I'm trying to move always into the intimate detail rather than the newspaper headline. And he begins to notice that the mail, M-A-I-L, has slowed down. Now, I didn't research this. A lot of people often imagine this, that the letters are not coming as quickly as and this frightens him. But as I was revising the book, I came across this and realized this is happening now, because this was literally happening in the America before the election, where a parcel sent from New York, and I was in California, was really not arriving. And everybody was talking about this. The mail was slowing down. I left it in the book. I just thought, well, I want one detail that connects. And it had happened organically on its own. But yes, I think it's impossible to read this book now without realizing it was written in this window when something really astonishingly frightening happened in America.
Thank you. In-depth question here. In delving into that space behind Mann's mask, do you feel that it was facing the ambiguity or avoiding it that fed into his creative energy?
I think that his creative energy comes from not knowing, that everything, that in a way, with each novel, he was trying to work out certain ideas that his dream life became for him significant. And as he was dreaming the lost family life in Buddenbrooks, if that hadn't been lost. But in other books, in Death in Venice, he was dreaming a sort of unresolved sexuality. And so it's always there, the idea that it's out of lack of resolution. It's out of doubt sort of distance between things that the power of the books emerges.
Do you find that today's university students react to Mann through a very different lens from readers who were born in the mid-20th century?
I haven't taught Mann in class, but at the moment I'm teaching both, and I did it before the pandemic as well, both James Joyce and Henry James. And it's really wonderful to watch people responding to USAs for the first time. You know, young people who are 19 or 20, finding these books tremendously exciting, and the same with Henry James. So it is, I mean, people talk about a dumbing down in the culture, and I think they've been talking about that since there was a culture. I think the ancient Greeks worried about that too. But I'm finding in America that there's a huge enthusiasm for these books among young people. So it might be the sort of quality of the young people at Columbia, but it's certainly, you just don't find any great change. It's still great. It's still that absolute enthusiasm for learning and for reading is still there.
Mm-hmm. And that's something we experience a lot of at the library, also not necessarily specifically, not only with young people, but with a range of people, which is truly refreshing. Someone mentions, having just read D.H. Lawrence in a seminar here at the library, the reader is struck by the points of similarity between them in terms of fluid sexuality. Would Mann have known Lawrence's work?
No, but I suppose there are connections in that these subjects, sexuality, fluid sexuality, masculinity, became burning subjects within modernism. I mean, in Ulysses, Leopold Bloom's masculinity is always being questioned or dealt with in various ways that are not, let's say, solid. You know, and of course, in Mann, this happens not only in Death in Venice, but in The Magic Mountain and in Dr. Faustus. Lawrence is different, though, in that one feels while his sexuality is fluid, the homosexual thing is, I think, very, very remote in him. That he's interested in some new way of opening space for sexual people. In an England that was Victorian when he was growing up, he wants to open that space. He's a preacher man, Lawrence, a lot of the time, for some sort of recognition that sexuality is not an animal thing, it's a spiritual thing. And he wants to create a religion around it. I don't think Mann wanted to do that. I think he just wanted to get away. I think he just wanted, you know, that if you could find if you could get the images right for what fascinated him, and what I want to emphasize again is that it wasn't merely sexuality that fascinated him. He was fascinated also by culture and by music and by what Germany meant. That many other things interested him. Where with Lawrence, you always feel it's just basically down to the phallus of the whole business of men and women, and that hardly anything else bothered
him. So, good question here, thinking about writing historical fiction and or inclusion of any real figures in fiction. Reader mentions, I love this novels, I love the master. When you were imagining scenes, dialogue, even events that aren't part of the historical record of Mann's life, did you put any limits on what you could attribute to a character inspired by a historical figure?
Now, you see, this begins as a sort of technical problem, and which is, are you going to attempt to reproduce German sound in an English dialogue sentence? Are you going to try and imagine what people spoke like in another language more than 100 years ago? And once you ask those questions, the answer is obvious. You can't do those things. So the decision I came to was to make the dialogue, to write the dialogue as though, especially once the children grow into their teens, and there's a lot of discussion at the table, to make that 1920s as find my source in Hemingway rather than in anything German. In other words, make the dialogue snappy, clipped, smart, fast moving, and that it was make it the very opposite. Go counterintuitive. Make it the very opposite to what you think Germans might have spoken like, with the verb at the end of the sentence, that instead of doing that, you go modern, you go contemporary, you make it sound like as I say, that those sort of snappy, smart people in, say, Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. And so that was the decision made. And I also found that I made rules that if Kathy was to speak, she was to say something interesting. She was never to be allowed be the domestic wife who was concerned with housekeeping. But she always had something much more interesting to say about politics, or about just witty and sometimes a self-assertive. And there's a lot of self-assertion going on. In other words, his children are assertive. His wife is assertive. His brother, and it's strange then making him more and more ghostly in the book, that he doesn't speak much, that he has to come out of his study to all this noise is going on in the house, but he's not making any. And he's always watching. He's always attempting to, in a way, escape. And this is all very important because the reader, the theory of this is that the reader would slowly become him, that you would come out of the study with him and watch all these people, being amused, some of the time irritated, others, but that the dialogue is there to, I suppose, amuse him, to give him something to listen to when he's not writing. But the technically, it really was a challenge.
As it is, I think, again, the language issue, but for any writer of historical fiction using real figures, so that's fantastic. So I think we're kind of moving towards wrapping up. There's a couple of more excellent questions here, and if anyone else has a question to throw in, please do so. Someone mentions that a favorite book is Joseph and His Brothers. Wonder if you have any particular thoughts about that one.
I had a problem with it, and I couldn't really deal with it in the book. I find it turgid. It doesn't sing for me. I mean, it doesn't do for me what the novels I've mentioned. So I haven't mentioned it. He really worked on it. He was very serious about it. I mean, he was for a whole decade. He was involved with it, and I know some people love those books. And maybe that's what I'll do if the pandemic doesn't end soon, and go back to them again. But no, they're not my favorite Thomas Mann books.
Fair enough. When you quote Mann as saying the hardest thing for him to write about is love, did you read that in his diary?
No. I made that up. But I was trying to think of what he would say. And in that moment where there's a painter talking about hands, it's really hard, as we all know, for painters to paint hands. They, even people who can do a face, the hands often look awkward. The painter just says, is there a thing that a writer has that like hands? And the answer is almost flippant. He's almost trying to just send the ball back and say, oh, but love. You go, okay, that must be hard. And in other words, I suppose he's talking ironically. And he's talking about, with all the ironies that he works with, how do you deal with love? I mean, in other words, with Death in Venice, it's hardly love you're talking about. In The Magic Mountain, it's always as though the ill health or decay or decline is actually more important. So it isn't as though, say, a love between a man and a woman, or between a father and a son. It isn't as though these are his big subjects. They're really not. He isn't interested in romance, and he isn't. Love isn't his thing. So I just thought it was worth putting in. But it's in dialogue, and it's set in a certain context, and it's late at night, and he's having a drink after dinner with these painters. He just throws it out. No, love, yeah, but hands for you, love for us.
That's fantastic. So someone has asked a question about future projects, and I want to drop in a related one, as I mentioned. The question here is there another figure whose life story you might want to render in a novel?
I don't have a third. And it takes me years. I mean, I was thinking, researching the man really for about 15 years. So I don't know if I'll do another.
But you do have another book coming out before too long. I hear a rumor it might be poetry related. Would you care to share?
Yeah, I have my first book of poetry coming in April. It's a book called Vinegar Hill. It's coming from Beacon Press. And here I am. I'm going to be almost 67. I wonder if that's a record of a 67-year-old man deciding to publish his first book of poetry. But that's what I'm doing. And I even got a request today when I come and do a reading somewhere. I thought, oh my God, we're going to read poetry. We're going to maybe wear a leather jacket. Like what? It's hard to think. Poets are so romantic and they're so, they're Dylan Thomas doing his readings and stuff. But anyway, it's a book of poems and it's coming out in April. And it better be good because I put a lot of work into it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, audience. This has been beautiful. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up that we haven't addressed?
I would just like to thank you all very much for coming and listening to me.